May we please call on stage Mr. Forbes to introduce our next speaker.
Wow, what a wonderful speech. I'm deeply grateful to Risa for delivering that speech. Play your game, play as a team, realize the potential. That's what Arangkada and that's what all of our co-sponsors, business groups and corporations want to see achieved. Can we give her another applause, a big applause? MAP has a table here, and I'm informing you that I would like to nominate Risa for Management Man of the Year next year. All right. All right, so now we're going to have a brief presentation on the water sector reform. This was originally going to be Secretary Gade, which was moved to the afternoon, and so the DOT, our presentation will be in the afternoon. Now, our presenter is one of the co-authors of the water policy brief that we released last year. You may not know Chris Ilagan, but you should know Chris Ilagan, because some years ago, he did government relations at Manila Water, and he was the most detailed contributor to our assessor of the sector in the assessments that we published 5 successive years on Arangkada. Chris moved on to 3M, and more recently he's moved on to Cargill. And yet he carries that passion for water reform and is a water expert that the business groups have designated, one of the 3, to the Congress to interact with the committees that are looking at the Department of Water. So Chris, could you come up and give us an update, please, on the water sector reform?
Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm not Secretary Tugade. I am lacking in both height and his godly voice. No? But it's a great opportunity for me to update you all on the status of the water sector reforms that the Arangkada has been pushing for over the past many years. Interestingly enough, it comes at a time that we come off a summer where we had water shortage, not just here in Metro Manila. We did experience that in Cebu. We saw it in Zamboanga, many other parts of the country, in fact. And even today, we've had to start rationing the water in Metro Manila in anticipation of what is foreseen to be a potential shortage again next summer. I guess, it has been under the Duterte administration, water has bubbled up again as a priority area. And we are glad to see that that has taken place. I guess it is providential that Sec Tugade had to push his time forward, because when we look at the theme of this conference today, it's actually turning on the tap. And when I first heard of the Arangkada's planned theme, I said, is water again another topic? They said, no, it's just an acronym for tourism, agribusiness, and power. But interestingly enough, in the context of these 3 sectors, water plays a crucial part. Tourism, we saw the interventions of the administration in Boracay. They have since expanded their concentration on improving water quality in the various other tourist destinations in the country. Agribusiness, believe it or not, 70 to 80% of the water that is used today is actually used by agriculture, right? What ends up in the news often is what we experience as water users, right? But that actually comprises only 10% of our entire water resources in the country. So agribusiness is obviously one important area that we have to improve the use of our water. Obviously power as well, not just the hydropower component, but you often hear about this water energy nexus, right? And the reason why that is the case, you need a lot of water to actually cool down your power plants and operate them. So, quite timely, and I guess Just to give an update, one of the key recommendations in our water policy brief last year it was around the idea of improving the governance in the water sector. Some of you may or may not know, but the water sector today is currently governed by about 32 agencies, right? And with that kind of course, it's quite typical in any bureaucracy, public or private, that silos exist, right? You can imagine that if there are overlapping mandates, right, you're going to end up in a situation where the actual use of that resource is probably not at its most optimal, right? And we're glad to see that the current Congress has taken on itself the push for a Department of Water Resources, as well as a Water Regulatory Commission. I'll explain these very briefly, what these are all about. But the Department of Water Resources is really largely focused on improving the way that we manage water as a resource across all our different uses. And the guiding principle there, if you'll allow me to read, because I think it's quite important in the way we're trying to look at how the future water sector will be governed. It will be largely governed by what they call integrated water resource management. And just as a definition, a participatory process, multi-stakeholder, which promotes the coordinated development and management of water, land, and related resources in order to maximize the resultant economic and social welfare in an equitable manner without compromising the sustainability of vital ecosystems. So you can really see it's an attempt to balance the use of water across different sectors. Oftentimes you will see domestic water supply or municipal water supply doing its own infrastructure program without thinking about potentially tapping a hydropower source which is just a few kilometers off, right? Or irrigation systems that exist today that could potentially actually be used for hydropower. Unfortunately today, because of the way that we are currently governed, we are facing a situation where basically each of the sectors are doing their own thing on water when there's so much synergy that should be capitalized across these different sectors. So as John explained earlier, well, I guess as an offshoot of the water shortage that we experienced last summer and the current rationing, the president did announce during his sauna that water is a priority area. He did actually call on the establishment of a Department of Water Resources. And what the House, well, the bill, there were actually 35 bills, right, that were filed around water, Department of Water Resources and Water Regulatory Commission. It was assigned to the Joint Committee on Government Reorganization and Public Works. And it was during basically the committee had tasked Congressman Salceda to serve as a TWG chair to consolidate these bills. And what came out after the month of recess that just finished is a bill that actually fuses together the concepts of a Department of Water Resources and Water Regulatory Commission. And that is, I believe it was just assigned to appropriations to finalize the budget and will be sent to floor for further deliberation. But I understand that the target is to have this passed in the House by January of next year. So you can see that there is quite a bit of momentum that we can pick up from this. Unfortunately, in the Senate, it hasn't moved as fast. But with all this pre-work being done in the House, hopefully we will see that it will be fast-tracked in terms of becoming a law. Just as a quick background so as I mentioned, the Department of Water Resources, IWRM, Integrated Water Resources Management, is the main guiding principle behind it. Some key, part of streamlining means that you're going to be getting rid of some of these agencies that exist today and fusing them into a mother entity. So the likes of your National Water Resources Board, the River Basin Control Office and the DNR will all become part of that core Department of Water agency. Some of these would also include the transfer of functions. For example, the EMB's water quality section, their work will be moved on to the Department of Water, just to make sure that when we deal with water, we're dealing with it, right, as a single resource. We are, one thing that I find a bit lacking, but it is mentioned in the current Department of Water bill, is the role of private sector participation. It was referenced a few times, but it's not very clear what sort of framework will be created under this Department of Water Resources that will enable private sector participation, right? So that's the Department of Water Resources, and as I mentioned earlier, that deals with all the uses of water. Now there's a subset of water, the water sector, as I mentioned earlier. We call it the water supply and sanitation subsector. And this is basically the water and sanitation services that you receive in your households with industry, right? And one reform that has been pushed for the past 2-3 decades actually is this concept of a water regulatory commission. And basically it's all about economic regulations, about setting of tariffs, technical standards that will govern the different water utilities and wastewater utilities out there. And the reason why we have felt that this was very important to achieving the universal access targets to water and sanitation is because without that, you do not create the proper incentives for your utilities to expand their coverage, improve their services. If you have a very weak, fragmented system, you end up in the situation that we are today. Some are working, you have the Metro Manila concessions having their own regulatory framework. You have the economic zones having their own, right? The question is, how do you ensure that your regulatory mechanisms will promote the expansion of these services to the more remote areas? The tendency, for example, we see with water districts is to maintain their commercial viability. They only end up servicing town proper. Right? Unfortunately, town proper is not the entire jurisdiction of a water district. But without proper regulation, they do not have the incentive to expand. So one of the key, I guess you can say, thrusts of the Water Regulatory Commission is to move regulation to what we call more performance-based, right? And I think this is taking off inspiration from the way the energy sector is currently regulated. So this WRC, Water Regulatory Commission, is part of this legislative, the legislative proposal currently pending in the House. We're looking forward to seeing that actually, well, the discussions today are actually more around, they're assuming that this will be passed and preparing now. So how do we actually set rates? What are the different sorts of water service providers that we should be allowing under a new regulatory framework? One interesting concept that has been pushed by various congressmen was when you talk about water utility services, automatically a water service provider will also be in charge of ensuring that the wastewater is properly treated and managed, right? And currently today, a lot of our water utilities don't do that. But as a matter of proper regulation, how do you ensure that you basically close the loop and close that cycle? And that's, I think, an interesting input from the congressman, which I personally agree with. Because the tendency is people are always willing to pay for water to their taps, but not always willing to pay for the wastewater services thereafter. If you do not bundle that, all right, who's going to pay for that? Who's left is the state, but we know that the state itself has limitations on budgets, right? So I'm quite glad to see that has moved on as a legislative proposal. Another one is really, how do you improve the efficiencies of these water utilities? And one concept that has come in is to encourage the amalgamation or aggregation of water service providers to create a bit more economy of scale that will hopefully help in terms of ensuring more affordable water rates, right, for everyone. These are the general updates of the water sector today, right? I do thank the Arangkada group for pushing for this particular advocacy. And I hope all of you here, we all need water to survive, right? Can continue being our voices out there to convince everyone that there is indeed a need to change and reform the water sector today. So with that, thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you, Mr. Ilagan. We would like to request that you stay on stage for the open forum. You may now approach the standing microphones on the floor to ask your questions. Please don't forget to mention your name and your affiliation.
If you have questions, feel free. Otherwise, we can also take it out on the side. Yes, ma'am. Sorry, yes. I saw you.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm Ami Ilagan from the business world.
Hello.
Kamag-anak. I'd like to know how the MWSS has been privatized. No? So how would the two concessionaires in Manila, Metro Manila, relate to this Water Regulatory Commission and the, what's the other one? The Water Resources
Sure.
body. How would it relate now? What changes it? Where would the pink fingers be pointing as to the water shortage?
Okay, thank you for the question, ma'am. Insofar as the regulatory regime, the idea, at least on the way the current bill is drafted, is that the regulatory office of MWSS will now be absorbed by the Water Regulatory Commission. However, the contract provisions on how rates are set, right, and how business plans are approved will remain the same. So basically, the Water Regulatory Commission will actually be abiding by the contract, except that the regulatory office, which is now under MWSS, will be under this WRC. Now, insofar as your question on how it relates to the Department of Water Resources, I guess one thing I did forget to mention, another key component of this bill is the development and implementation of a water resources management plan. Right now, I guess the big talk right now that you read in the news is what are these water resources being developed? And you do hear things about Laguna Lake, you hear about Wawa Dam, you hear about Kaliwa. These are all being pushed and pursued right now, and there's no stopping these projects, I think, from moving forward. But the future Department of Water Resources will be identifying what sort of, basically, they take a survey, where are all our water resources? Given the future economic plans across the country, right, including Metro Manila, what are the resources and how should they be developed to serve the different purposes, be it irrigation, hydropower, and including municipal water. So that's where I would imagine it being, those are the areas of intersection with the current bill. Thank you. I guess maybe we can take one more. And okay, two more. Julian?
Thank you, Julian Payne, Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Your talk inspires me to remember the great poem of the rhyme of the ancient mariner, water, water all around us, and not a drop to drink. You didn't touch upon the issue of desalination and the relation of that to power supply and new technology that Riza mentioned. I am aware there's at least one desalination plant in operation. I think it's in Mactan. Is there any advanced thinking going forward to exploit the water that surrounds us at all sides? Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. There are provisions in the bill right now that recognize that there are emerging technologies, right? I'm trying to recall whether there's outright mention of desalination, but that said, the drive is to push for new technologies available, and ideally those that are locally available as well. So if all of a sudden we have some inputs to desal technology, these are the things that will be promoted under this bill. I think there is general recognition that that has to be an option that we consider. We do know that still today, costs are relatively prohibitive when you have surface water or groundwater available. But we also know that there are sustainability questions around that as well, and desal does offer in certain situations, right? Probably a good answer to fulfilling the water requirements in those specific areas. That said, I know that one thing that has normally kept water utility operators from pursuing it is really the cost, right? But we do see that cost is going down quite fast, right? And before we know it, it might actually be easier to do desal right? Especially along coastal areas that might have enough demand to justify that, right? It's really just making sure that it's something that the public can afford as well in those specific areas. But thank you, and a good point raised. Last question, sir.
Former Undersecretary for Consumer Affairs at DTI and now a consumer advocate, leading consumer advocate of the Ralph Nader of the Philippines.
Thank you, John, for inviting me here. Good morning. Chris, just two questions. No? Number one, did I hear right that 80% of our water resources are used for agribusiness and that only 10% goes to residential and household use? Okay. With that statistics, were there discussions in the two pending bills on probably reviewing? I'm sure Manila Water is a major sponsor of the event. No? Were there discussions that were brought up in the deliberation of the bill that would probably say, let's bring back to government the management of the water for household use? Second, I've seen some news report also on the deliberation of the bill. May I ask you, were there consumer groups represented during the hearing? And I understand there will be hearing still in January, in which case I'll give you our business card, Chris, and we are very active particularly in rate making, you know. We have many pending issues with the regulatory office as I speak today. So I guess we want to see how the Water Regulatory Commission bill is being crafted in relation to the transition from the regulatory office to this particular regulatory body. With that, thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Sir Vic. Probably I would, during the deliberations, no? Yes, actually, the topic of the current Metro Manila concessionaires did come up. I guess the records would bear that. There was no mention of necessarily government takeover, but there was a discussion that, I think there's an attempt to balance consumer interest with, I guess, ensuring that we are still able to attract private sector participation and investment in the sector. I guess just to point out, a recent study has shown that it'll take about 1 trillion pesos till 2030, right, for us to just meet the universal access goals under the SDGs. Right? At 1 trillion pesos, government just does not have enough, and neither will the ODA be enough to cover that, which is why they're saying private sector will have a major part, and I think that's what they were trying to balance, right? But they did insert a provision that where public interest so dictates, right, the state may undergo a process of reviewing private sector contracts that exist today. Insofar as the consumer groups, I don't recall seeing any. So please do send me your card and we'll make sure that you're part of the future discussion, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ilagan. Another warm round of applause.